What you're about to hear is a first-person confession, inspired by the real story, or perhaps the legend, of what happened inside a small psychology lab in 1924. Officially, the project was meant to study human emotion through facial expressions. Unofficially, it went much further. I've spent decades avoiding this story, burying it beneath academic achievements and framed credentials. But the images never left me. They're still there, 701 of them, burned into glass plates and into my brain, their eyes wide, twisted, frozen in that perfect instant between fear and obedience. They stare back at me when I close my own. I did not intend for things to go that far. That's what I told myself, over and over. It began as science, a pure desire to capture raw emotion, not performance, not pretense, but the real thing. The involuntary grimace, the primal panic, the truth behind the mask. What I built was not a lab, it was a trap. And once I stepped into it, I wasn't the scientist anymore. I was just another subject. They always smiled too early. That was my first observation. Before the stimulus even landed, before the punchline, before the smell, before the sound, the face would shift. The lips would twitch into place like an actor remembering his line. That's when I knew everything we'd studied about emotional expression was a lie. Darwin, Duchenne, even James, all brilliant, all wrong. The human face is not a mirror of the soul. It is a mask molded by culture, habit, survival. I didn't want masks. I wanted the crack beneath them. At first, I believed photography might help. I studied the muscle maps of Duchenne de Boulogne, those eerie snapshots where electrodes forced expressions onto paralyzed men, grimaces that belonged to no real feeling. They called it science. I called it theater. The subjects weren't reacting to anything. They were being puppeteered. What good is a smile if it's mechanically conjured? I wanted authenticity, raw, unscripted terror. Not the kind you feign at the opera or recreate on stage, but the silent scream before a car crash, the look of betrayal before a knife sinks in, that split second where the mind loses its grip and the body tells the truth. So I decided to find it. I was 25, too young to be trusted with anything, let alone people. But I had charm, credentials, and an obsession that burned clean through sleep. I pitched my idea to the department, a study on the taxonomy of emotional expression. No one questioned it. They gave me a room, a small grant, and full access to the undergraduate pool. Students signed up in droves, curiosity, extra credit, or the sheer boredom of campus life. It didn't matter. I had my subjects. But here's the part I never admitted in the papers. It wasn't about classifying expressions. That was just the excuse. The charts, the variables, the codebooks, all smoke. What I really wanted was singularity. That exact moment when a face stops pretending. Not 1 second before, not 1 second after. I stared at them for hours, these fresh, unworn faces. I studied how their eyes fluttered during silence, how their cheeks stiffened when they sensed discomfort. I tracked their micro-reactions as if decoding a sacred language. And yet, something was always missing. The expressions felt managed, like they were aware of being watched. They played to the camera, to me, so I started removing their context. First, I eliminated verbal cues, no instructions, no conversation, just observation. Then I dimmed the lights. Then I isolated them from each other. Still, the expressions felt diluted, performative. Even fear looked rehearsed. That's when I understood. I couldn't just observe emotion. I had to extract it, force it to the surface, make them forget they were being watched. That realization, that quiet pivot in my mind, was the moment the experiment changed. It was no longer academic. It was intimate, violent, spiritual. I wasn't collecting data. I was peeling skin, layer by layer, until anything twitched. I stopped seeing them as students. They became canvases, triggers, gateways. I remember one subject, a girl with freckles and a nervous laugh, whose eyes widened just slightly when I moved closer. Not fear, not yet, but the beginning of it, the anticipation, that was real. I felt it bloom between us like a secret. That night I developed the film in total silence. Her face, caught mid-blink, filled the tray like a ghost surfacing from black water. She wasn't smiling, she wasn't posing. For the first time I saw a face without intention, and I wanted more. They told me the room was mine to design, so I made it a lie. It started with the lighting. Harsh fluorescents were replaced with warm table lamps, one on the corner desk, another on a small round table beside a high-backed chair. Not too modern, not too sterile. I chose a soft amber glow, the kind that reminded you of a living room, a place where nothing bad could happen. Then came the walls. I covered the concrete with floral wallpaper, yellowed just slightly at the edges to give the illusion of age, of safety. A bookshelf filled with outdated psychology texts sat beneath a dusty painting of a farmhouse at dusk. I placed a plush rug in the center, the kind that muffles sound, just enough to feel like silence isn't empty, just comfortable. The chair was upholstered in dark red velvet, wide enough to feel inviting, narrow enough to restrict movement. Every detail was calculated, not for aesthetics, for control. Because while it looked like a room for conversation, for coffee or contemplation, it was nothing of the sort. It was a stage, a carefully engineered theater for unraveling the human mind. Hidden behind the bookshelves were two small pinhole lenses, one aimed at the chair, the other at the subject's entrance. Under the rug, tiny microphones recorded even the faintest shifts, the scrape of a shoe, the flecks of fingers against fabric. The lamps weren't just for ambience, they concealed directional microphones, a mirror on the far wall, one-way glass, and just behind it, my own seat, a stool in the dark, close enough to see breath, far enough not to be seen. But the most important feature was invisibility. Nothing in the room screamed experiment. No wires trailing, no cameras blinking, no signs of structure. It had to feel untouched, unmonitored. Only then could I watch them drop the act. I tested it on myself first. I sat in that chair for hours, staring at the lamp, listening to the silence, letting my own nervous system speak. My hands sweated, my heart raced. The room whispered things, not with sound, with pressure. I knew then it would work. When the students entered, they hesitated. Most offered polite smiles, glancing around for a clipboard, a white coat, a lab tech. There was none. I welcomed them with minimal instruction. Just take a seat. This will only take a few minutes. Then I left the room. The door clicked behind them, and I watched. Some crossed their legs and waited, gazing into the middle distance like they were expecting a question. Others fidgeted, their eyes darting from lamp to mirror to bookshelf. A few began whispering to themselves. One girl stood up, walked to the shelf, picked up a book, and read the same page 3 times before setting it down. Her foot tapped uncontrollably. But the room didn't just record behavior, it shaped it. I began adjusting environmental factors. Sometimes the lamp would flicker, sometimes I piped in low, almost imperceptible frequencies through the floor. Once I filled the air with a faint, unplaceable smell. Hospital gloves and rotting fruit. No one could name it, but their expressions changed. They stopped performing. The room made them forget where they were, who they were. It dissolved the boundary between experiment and experience. They weren't participants anymore. They were prey. And I was the room. It began with a single note. I played a dissonant chord, a clash of minor intervals that lingered in the air like a wound that refused to close, then silence, then again. The subjects twitched, some winced. A few looked toward the speaker, unsure if it had even happened. I documented every flicker of eyelid, every compression of the lips. But they were still aware of the performance. I could see it, the way they tried to make their discomfort readable. Like they were helping me, acting for the camera they didn't know existed. So I shifted. I introduced metallic screeches, high-pitched tones that mimicked dental drills or brakes failing at high speed. Each sound lasted just a second too long, not long enough to be dismissed, not short enough to ignore. I watched their bodies react before their minds caught up. Muscles clenching, eyes narrowing, hands fidgeting on the velvet arms of the chair. Then came the smells. A sealed canister beneath the rug released a slow stream of chemical odor, ammonia, rot, something not quite dead but certainly dying. It hit them suddenly. A few gagged. One student covered his mouth and looked around as if trying to locate the source, confused by the pleasant appearance of the room. Another stared at the mirror with wide, questioning eyes, as if finally realizing she was not alone. That's when I started photographing. Hundreds of images, every tick, every wince, every subtle collapse of composure. I captured their expressions at the threshold, not full terror, not complete disgust, but that delicate point in between where the face forgets its script and begins to write something real. I developed the film obsessively, the trays filled with faces emerging from blackness, contorted and bare. My walls became a gallery of human fracture. I studied them at night, tracing their shapes with my finger, memorizing the curvature of suffering. And yet, something wasn't right. Even in the best photos, there was resistance, a hesitation, as if the expressions themselves were self-conscious, controlled. They weren't breaking, they were bracing. It infuriated me. I wanted to believe it was enough, that I was seeing into them, but the images betrayed the truth. There was still a sliver of intention behind each reaction, a mental hand on the wheel. I increased the stimuli. Now it wasn't just unpleasant sound, it was chaos. I played recordings of crying children, looped whispers, a man screaming phrases in a language no one recognized. The sounds were layered until they became indistinct, like a language invented for madness. I watched as pupils dilated, as shoulders tightened. One subject curled her legs into the chair and rocked gently. Another asked to leave. I said nothing. The door stayed closed. Still, the expressions were not pure. They were anticipatory, defensive, like they expected something worse. That was the problem. Expectation. As long as they believed they were in an experiment, they were prepared. They wore invisible armor. No matter how much I twisted the environment, they adapted. Their minds rationalized discomfort as temporary, justified, safe. I didn't want safe. I wanted the moment before safety, the gasp before the scream. That instant of involuntary honesty when a person realizes the world has slipped out of their control. And so, as I watched the 50th subject flinch politely at a sound designed to mimic death, I understood. I hadn't gone far enough. Discomfort wasn't the key. Shock was. Something unpredictable, something that tore the context from their minds, leaving nothing but the raw, unfiltered face behind. Not pain, not fear, surprise, a betrayal of reality itself. That night, as I sat in the darkroom, surrounded by faces that had almost told me the truth, I began designing a new stimulus. No sound, no smell, no illusion. Just one question. What would they do if I handed them a living creature and a knife? The polite layers had to come off. What I needed could not be reached through suggestion or sensory tricks. Their reactions were still governed by dignity, by the idea of being watched, by a desire, no matter how buried, to be perceived as human. That was the final illusion I had to break, so I changed the protocol. When the participants entered the room, they found a folded note on the chair. It was handwritten, personal. It read, "Remove your clothing, fold it neatly, sit down, you are safe." Most hesitated. A few left, but many complied. And once they were stripped of their fabric identities, no logos, no buttons, no layers to fidget with, they became blank, fragile, beautifully unarmed. I added another element, a sealed envelope with typed confessions from previous participants, or so I claimed. In truth, I wrote them all. Confessions of cheating, stealing, hitting a sibling, wishing someone dead. I instructed the subject to read them aloud. Slowly, some obeyed. Others stuttered, their eyes darting to the mirror. They didn't know whose secrets they were reading. That was the point. I watched their faces for signs of resonance, disgust, recognition. Then I played the screams. At first they sounded distant, a woman calling for help, a child sobbing. Then they grew louder, closer. Loops of indistinct agony with no context, no resolution. There was no narrative to latch onto, only distress, repeated and unrelenting. Some subjects covered their ears. One man wept silently, shoulders shaking, lips pressed together as if trying to hold himself inside. Another began to laugh, a thin, high-pitched giggle that grew into something sharp and frantic. He stared at the mirror and waved as if greeting someone on the other side. I leaned closer to the glass, breath fogging the surface, watching the microspasms around his mouth. That one, he almost gave it to me. Almost. But I needed more. So I introduced the final layer, death. Not metaphor, not symbolism, flesh. In a hidden compartment beneath the cabinet, I placed the body of a small animal, a rabbit, a bird, sometimes a raccoon, left to decay just long enough to sour the air. I'd open the vent during the reading. The moment the odor hit, their expressions would shift. Some dry-heaved, one vomited, but I wasn't after disgust. I wanted the moment their brain refused to rationalize the situation. What was this room? What kind of study was this? That's where truth began. Their eyes betrayed them, flicking toward the door, the mirror, the ceiling, anywhere to find order in what was rapidly becoming chaos. Their faces began to stutter, cycling through fear, anger, pleading, confusion, no longer able to settle on the right emotion for the moment. Because there wasn't one. There was no script for this. And in that confusion, I found honesty. They were no longer students, no longer volunteers. They were consciousness, stripped and trembling, reacting to stimuli they didn't understand in a place that had stopped pretending to care. I recorded everything, every twitch, every spasm, every breakdown. My photo collection expanded. My wall became a shrine to human unraveling, and I felt close, so close. I started dreaming in expressions. My sleep was haunted by half faces, mouths mid-scream, eyes fixed in silent epiphanies. Sometimes I'd wake gasping, convinced I had seen it, the true face, just before waking, and yet I hadn't captured it completely. There was always resistance, a flicker of self, some corner of their mind still whispering, "This is temporary, this is science, this will end." What if it didn't? What if the subject had to choose, not react, not endure, but act, to commit, to cross a line they couldn't uncross? That's when I prepared the next phase. Something living, something warm, something they would have to kill. I introduced the box without ceremony. It was small, metal, and unmarked, placed at the center of the rug, beneath the warm glow of the lamp. Inside, the rat moved slowly, cautiously, its pale tail trailing behind like a question mark. I left it there, untouched, as the subject entered and took their place in the chair. They always noticed the box first. Some asked, some didn't. Then I handed them the scalpel, sterile, clean, wrapped in white gauze and tied with a string. "This is part of the experiment," I said, "just one cut for science." Most blinked. Some stared at me, searching my face for some hint of satire, for the punchline to a twisted joke, but I offered none. only silence, and the sound of the rat's feet scratching softly against the metal floor. 21 participants, 15 obeyed. Some asked questions. Is it anesthetized? Will it feel pain? What's the point? I answered as vaguely as I could. It's important, I said. We need to measure the instant of moral hesitation. I used words like clinical, controlled, necessary. None of it was true. What I wanted couldn't be measured. It had to be witnessed. The first subject to comply was a medical student. He didn't hesitate. He lifted the lid, reached in, and did it with the detached precision of a future surgeon. But that wasn't the reaction I wanted. His face barely moved. His hands didn't shake. It was the second one, a girl from the literature department, who gave me what I needed. Her fingers trembled as she untied the string. Her lips parted slightly. She whispered, "I'm sorry," to the rat before lifting the blade. And when she brought it down, something in her face broke open. It wasn't cruelty. It wasn't horror. It was confusion, a collapse of certainty. I pressed the shutter at that exact moment. The click echoed in the room like a gunshot. From then on, I changed nothing. The rat stayed the same. The blade stayed the same. Only the subjects changed. Each one bringing their own sense of morality, expectation, terror. Some cried. One refused to look at the animal. He closed his eyes and struck anyway. Another chanted under his breath, a mantra of justification, his voice cracking as he did it. One girl vomited afterward. Another laughed again, that same sharp, frantic sound, more feral than human. But none of them left. Even those who hesitated, who held the knife in silence, who stared into the box for minutes, eventually did it. Some said afterward they felt pressured, that they thought it was part of the grade, that I'd told them to. I hadn't. I'd only suggested. And that was enough. Obedience, I realized, didn't require force, just framing. A white coat, a confident tone, a closed door. They wanted to be told. They needed it. I watched each act with a stillness I didn't recognize in myself. I felt nothing, not pity, not revulsion, only a quiet kind of fascination, like watching fire consume paper, inevitable and strangely beautiful. Each expression became more raw, more fragmented. My collection grew. 711 photographs, each one a moment of fracture. But something had shifted. Not in them, in me. The act no longer satisfied. The faces, though real, began to blur. I saw the same contortions, the same betrayals of innocence, again and again. I began to feel as though I was photographing the same soul in different bodies, the same fear, the same compliance, over and over. The rat squealed once during a session, just once. A high, shrill sound that cut through everything. And for a moment, I froze. Not because of the sound, but because of the silence that followed. It was complete, thick, reverent. I stood there, the camera in my hand, staring at the subject, at the blood on the gloves, and I felt something I couldn't name. A tremor, not in my hands, but in my certainty. Not because I had gone too far, but because I hadn't gone far enough. I used to believe I was chasing expressions, raw emotion, undiluted and unfiltered. But the knife changed that. It wasn't the facial reactions that haunted me. Not really. It was the pause before the act. That small, electric moment when the subject looked at me, eyes wide, waiting, unsure. That hesitation told me more than any photograph ever could. It revealed something deeper than fear, deeper than disgust. It revealed obedience. I wasn't studying emotion anymore. I was witnessing submission. None of them had to do it. I never forced their hands. I never threatened. I never raised my voice. And yet, they did it. Most of them. Not because they wanted to, but because I was there. Because I was the one asking. Because I held the clipboard and the title and the door key. That's when I realized the experiment wasn't about what faces do under pressure. It was about what people do when someone tells them they should. I started reviewing the footage with new eyes, watching not the subjects, but myself. The way I stood, the cadence of my voice, the phrasing of the command. This is part of the experiment. Just those words, enough to suspend morality, enough to make them believe that the rules, the real ones, had been rewritten in this space. I didn't need to shout, I didn't need to persuade, I only needed to be confident. They filled in the rest. They assumed consequences that didn't exist. They imagined failure, judgment, loss. They obeyed because they feared what it might mean not to. And that fear, that invisible architecture, was the real machinery of the experiment. It wasn't the rat. It was the power of the white coat. I began to test this idea more deliberately. Subtle shifts. I changed my tone, softened my language. I pretended to hesitate. When I appeared unsure, they hesitated too. When I projected certainty, they followed. It was a dance, and I led every step. One subject, a philosophy major, sat with the scalpel in her lap for nearly 20 minutes. I said nothing. I waited. She began to cry, not because of the rat, but because she wanted me to speak, to clarify, to tell her what was right. When I finally whispered, "It's okay," she acted within seconds. Another asked, "Do I have to?" I replied, "It would help." That was all he needed. They wanted absolution. They wanted to transfer the burden to someone in charge. And I gave it to them, gladly, because the more they obeyed, the more I understood. This wasn't science anymore. It was authority, and I was wearing it like a second skin. The data, the photos, the measurements, they were distractions, footnotes in a study that had transformed into something primal, something ancient, something cultic. I stopped pretending to analyze facial muscles. Instead, I documented surrender. Expression was just a symptom. Submission was the disease. I found myself looking at strangers differently. The cashier who handed change without eye contact, the pedestrian who stopped at a red light in an empty street. Everywhere I looked, I saw ritual, compliance, structure, and beneath it all, fear. Fear of stepping outside the frame, fear of disappointing the figure on the other side of the glass. They say the camera never lies, but it doesn't tell the truth either. It only captures what it's allowed to see. There were 701 photographs in total, each one taken at the moment I believe something had broken through, a mask slipping, a boundary crossed, a truth revealed. I catalogued them meticulously, labeled each with subject number, stimulus, timestamp. I treated them like relics, holy objects in a twisted liturgy, but none of them matched, not one. I laid them side by side. I built entire walls of faces, raw, contorted, blank, shattered. Some looked like pain, some like guilt, some were unreadable altogether. But never, not once, did I find the consistency I had sought from the beginning. There was no universal face of fear, no shared code for horror, just chaos. Expression, it turned out, was not a language, it was a dialect, and each face spoke in tongues I would never fully translate. Still, I couldn't stop looking. I moved the images from the lab to my apartment. I covered the walls, the ceilings, even the insides of drawers. They became my audience, my companions. In the silence of those long nights, I spoke to them. I apologized. I justified. I asked them questions they couldn't answer, and sometimes they responded, not in words, not even in movement, but in presence. I would walk into a room and feel them watching. I'd glance up and swear one of them had changed. A mouth slightly more open, an eye a fraction more focused. I began to test this, marking their positions, the angles, the shadows, but the differences were never physical. They were emotional, subtle shifts that defied measurement but screamed in my gut. One photo, subject 47, began to smile, just barely, just enough to unnerve. I had taken that photo during the moment she released the scalpel. Her hand had trembled, her lips had parted in something between horror and relief. But now there was a grin, not wide, not cartoonish, just knowing. Another, Subject 12 began to blink. The photo didn't change, of course, not in any rational sense, but I felt it. That impossible stutter in my perception, a momentary absence in her stare, like a skipped frame in an old film reel. I blinked in return, just to be sure I still existed. I stopped sleeping. When I closed my eyes, the faces multiplied. I didn't dream of the photos. I dreamed of places they had never been. A classroom filled with screaming portraits. A staircase where each step was a different jawline. My own reflection replaced entirely by stitched-together features from my collection. I left the city for a while, rented a cabin, took nothing with me. But the faces followed. They appeared in wood grain, in condensation, in the creases of my pillow. I began to carry a notebook, sketching them when they surfaced. Not perfect renditions, just impressions. But even in those crude outlines, I recognized them, the expressions, the moments I had captured, the memories they refused to let me forget. Once, in the mirror, I saw my own face shift, just slightly, a new line beneath the eye, a tightness in the cheek that hadn't been there before, and I realized with sudden clarity, I had joined them. I was one of the 711 now, a frozen expression, endlessly observed, no longer the scientist, no longer the observer, just another face on the wall. They whisper to me now, not in language, but in presence. When I pass through a room, I feel them leaning in. When I speak aloud, I sense their judgment. They are not angry. They are not sad. They are waiting. For what, I don't know. Perhaps for me to finish, perhaps for someone else to begin, but their eyes don't leave me, not when I sleep, not when I eat, not even when I stare back. Because they know what I did. And worse, they know I still don't regret it. I don't know where I am now. Sometimes I think it's a hospital, other times a basement. The walls are blank, but I see faces in the patterns, smudges that shift when I blink. I'm not allowed mirrors anymore. They said it's for my safety. I know better. They're still watching me. I feel them when the lights flicker. I hear them when the faucet drips, the 711. They haven't forgotten. And now, when I close my eyes, I don't see the photographs anymore. I see new faces. Yours, maybe. Someone is listening to this. I know that much. Maybe out of curiosity, maybe out of guilt, maybe because you recognize what I found, what I became. It's not over. It never was. The experiment didn't fail. It just escaped. And if you're listening to this, maybe you're one of us now.